My name is Morgan Hayes, a 33-year-old real estate attorney who thought contracts could tame anything until my billionaire father trudged up the sand of Tybee Island, Georgia, and declared my late uncle's weather-beaten cottage a rotting liability he'd happily confiscate for my own good. A sentence that felt less like concern and more like a foreclosure notice on my dignity. And while the Atlantic wind raked shell grit across the porch, I realized a man who measures love in square footage would never respect a daughter who measures worth in memories. Yet I still hadn't grasped how far he was willing to go to bulldoze both. That night, rain hammered the tin roof like a courtroom gavel, and a Blue Marlin appraisals email arrived CCing every relative claiming the place needed $600,000 in emergency repairs. An absurd figure that might scare even seasoned investors. But what froze my pulse was the subject line, Family Safety Alert, because he was weaponizing fear to paint me reckless. And each attachment felt like a fresh nail sealing my reputation into a box I didn't build, leaving me staring at rotting receipts that smelled of corporate ink while lightning backlit the shutters like prison bars. The silence between thunderclaps pulsing with unspoken dare. I walked the cottage alone, tracing Uncle James's initials carved near the pantry, hearing floorboards whine like ship masts in a gale. And the mix of sea salt nostalgia and present dread brewed a taste of betrayal sharp enough to bite my tongue. Yet beneath the hurt, my lawyer brain cataloged discrepancies, wrong permit codes, inflated labor rates. A counselor Pierce, who'd misspelled easement 3 times, evidence that the appraisal was a counterfeit. And I felt the slow, deliberate shift from wounded daughter to forensic strategist. A pivot as quiet as a key turning in an old lock, hinting at doors Dad never meant for me to open. Just before dawn, with storm clouds retreating and the air reeking of wet magnolia. My phone buzzed again, a group chat ping from my younger brother, Miles, begging me to be reasonable before investors bail. And that single line confirmed Dad's true motive: he needed my deed to close financing on an eco-luxe resort. A project stalled unless he held every grain of shoreline, so his campaign of concern was really a leveraged buyout of blood ties. And suddenly, the betrayal expanded beyond me, threatening turtles that nested under our dune fence and neighbors who trusted the horizon to stay uncluttered, which meant this wasn't just personal. It was environmental, a public battle disguised as family drama. I brewed coffee so strong it tasted like burnt resolve, drafted a subpoena request on my cracked laptop, and looped in Theo Nguyen, a cybersecurity friend who treats metadata like breadcrumbs. Within hours, he traced Blue Marlin's seed funding to a Harborline shell company, then unearthed an encrypted email where Dad promised County Commissioner Harlan Phelps a 10% kickback once Mo folds. The shorthand nickname he used when I was 6 and thought surrendering was cute. A discovery that split nostalgia from the present like lightning splitting a live oak, leaving no shelter for excuses, only the bare trunk of fact. And facts are kindling when a lawyer needs fire. Yet righteous adrenaline can't muffle heartbreak. At sunset, Seth, my architect husband, confessed Harborline had once courted him to design that same resort, a secret he'd buried to protect me. And the mixture of affection and omission stung worse than salt in a cut, sparking our first real fight as amber sky faded to violet. And at its peak, I nearly asked whether any blueprint, marital or coastal, could survive hidden foundations. But the argument cracked open something sturdier. We vowed transparency even if it cost us comfort, cementing the idea that walls can guard or imprison, depending on who holds the mortar. A truth that would shape every move ahead. 2 nights later, as cicadas droned like faulty transformers, cottage cameras caught Dad himself prying open the breaker box, blueprint tube tucked under one arm. He didn't smash anything, he rearranged. A picture frame of Uncle James now leaned crooked, a symbolic slap, and on the counter he left new renderings of a boardwalk slicing through nesting dunes, plus a handwritten note, "Last offer." Sweetheart. My hands shook, equal parts fury and eerie calm, because a trespass caught on video converts outrage into admissible proof, and proof is currency in any courtroom, municipal or familial. So instead of calling him, I copied the footage to 3 drives and labeled them Storm Surge Exhibit A, feeling the tide inside me crest. With August's Planning Commission hearing only 4 days away, the NOAA tracker painted a swirl of potential hurricanes offshore, mirroring the swirl in my gut. But while storms can rip roofs, they also excavate buried truths. And I decided Dad would learn that in Savannah. The very turtle laws he once underestimated now had a lawyer who'd make them bite, a daughter who'd turn every forged estimate, every secret loan, every moonlit trespass into a chain so tight no deal could wriggle free. And as I stapled subpoena packets under the glow of a single Edison bulb, I smiled for the first time since the deluge began, knowing the real tempest was about to make landfall inside the Civic Center, on live stream, with thousands watching, and he still believed I was just a girl clinging to nostalgia. Precisely the miscalculation that would sink him next. 4 dawns later, the Civic Center parking lot looked like a film set for coastal apocalypse news vans sprouting satellite dishes, conservationists waving placards painted with baby turtle silhouettes, and Harborline investors in linen jackets refreshing stock apps as if thumb pressure could stop freefall. Yet inside the green room, I breathed slower than I ever had. Because my portfolio was colder than Fear Blue Marlin's fake loan trail, Dave Jensen's honest quote, Theo's decrypted kickback mails, Jenna's breaker box video, and a sworn statement from Noah that loggerhead nesting peaked exactly where Dad planned to pour concrete, a spread of facts so lethal it hummed beneath my fingertips. And when Seth squeezed my shoulder, he felt the vibration and whispered, "Aim straight." Words that landed like flint on steel just as the stage manager called my name, opening the door to a hall packed beyond capacity, anticipation prickling my skin like the charged air before a hurricane's eye. Robert opened the session with all the swagger of a televangelist, hologram renderings floating behind him, glistening villas, fiber optic walkways glowing turtle-safe amber, recycled water fountains shaped like seashells, while Mom live-streamed from the front row, captioning every legacy starts with vision, and Miles flanked Dad reading a speech that promised jobs, tax revenue, and zero displacement of native species, a phrase that would boomerang. But first I let him finish, because predators tire themselves bragging, and when the commission chair asked for public rebuttal, I rose in a suit the color of storm clouds, heels cracking like starter's pistols, and unrolled Jensen's foam board beside Blue Marlin's, the 30-foot cost gap flickering on twin monitors, producing a gasp so unified it sounded like the building exhaled. And before Robert could regroup, Dave himself stood from the audience, sun-leathered, soft-spoken, stating under penalty of perjury that his quote was real, and any contractor claiming triple costs was either incompetent or incentivized. A sentence that snapped flashbulbs and shaved 15% off Harborline's share price in the time it takes a wave to slap a seawall. Dad tried humorous tourniquet, chuckling that market fluctuations weren't civic concerns, but I overrode him by dropping Theo's slide, the $400,000 no-interest equipment loan from a Harborline Shell LLC to Blue Marlin 3 weeks before their appraisal, the ink-red arrows forming a noose around the company logo. And when Commissioner Phelps shifted in his seat, beads of sweat loud as hail on the mic, Theo zoomed the second email. Phelps, thanking Robert for the easement incentive. Code the FBI would decode later, Murmurs mutated into booing. Mom's phone livestream flooded with turtle emojis, and shares plunged another 8 points. Yet Robert still smirked at me, perhaps believing corporate muscle could bulldoze public perception. So I triggered Jenna's hidden cam footage of him unlatching my breaker in moonlight. Blueprint rolled like a weapon, and the hall went silent in a way sirens never manage, because everyone recognized the arrogance of trespass, the cowardice of acting big only when no one is watching. And that silence sharpened the gavel Judge Brooks let fall moments later, recommending RICO investigation. The sound, a steel drum announcing the storm's true landfall. Outside, cameras blinded as coastal wind hurled protest banners skyward. Robert tried shielding his face, but lenses devoured every flinch. And when a reporter shouted, "Will Harborline, honor the loggerhead buffer, now," he barked. "No comment yet," Miles blurted. "We'll comply with any remediation," contradicting him on live feed. Proof blood ties dissolve when liquidity evaporates. A public crack that widened an hour later when SEC filings halted Harborline trading pending irregularities. And by evening, my phone pinged with an apology text from Miles. I flipped to protect the company. "Not Dad. Hope someday that's enough." A confession that stung less than expected, because vengeance had already grown larger than sibling resentment, morphing into a tide-shifting corporate ethics, and tides never ask permission to rise. That night, the cottage lights glowed off-grid solar gold, while Seth and I stapled turtle-safe filters on porch bulbs, thunder rumbling offshore. And for the first time since Blue Marlin's email, the silence felt like real quiet, not the muting pressure of dread. Yet peace carries its own undertow. And at midnight, headlights crawled up the sand lane Robert's sedan. Alone. Hazards blinking like surrender flags, he stepped out clutching a manila envelope. No security, no swagger, just rain darkening his suit shoulders as he approached our dune fence, stopping before the no trespass sign he'd ignored weeks earlier. And I met him mid-path, heart steady because evidence had drained the venom out of his presence. He extended the envelope without eye contact. Inside lay a notarized share transfer gifting 5% of his remaining Harborline stock to the Loggerhead Savannah Trust and a handwritten line. "I built walls where lighthouses were needed. Teach me to volunteer. If you can." The words weren't absolution, but they were weight, and acceptance required boundaries. So I said, "Wednesday dawn. Bring gloves, not blueprints. We clean the beach with the school kids." And he nodded, sea spray masking either tears or drizzle, an ambiguity I left unsolved as he walked back to the car. Taillights disappearing like embers the tide would soon quench. Closing the night, but not the work ahead. 2 weeks later, under a sky the color of fresh slate, hatchlings emerged from a nest Seth had roped off during construction. Their tiny flippers scooting through our footprints toward moon-silver surf. Volunteers hushed, GoPros rolled, and among the silhouettes, Robert knelt, trash bag in hand, collecting plastic shards the storm washed up. An image I stored not as forgiveness, but as evidence that even those who bulldoze can learn to build when the blueprint changes. And as the last hatchling vanished in a sparkle of foam, I felt the final plank of Uncle James's cottage settle solid beneath my feet. A house no longer at war, but at watch. The lighthouse still standing, its beam now cast beyond family drama toward whoever next needs legal fire in the dark. The kind that starts with one stubborn deed and ends with a shoreline safe for every fragile shell that refuses to quit crawling forward. Thanksgiving week drifted in on a tide of cinnamon and wet leaf chill. And while Savannah tourists queued for pralines, I sat in a courthouse conference room watching Dad swear an affidavit that Harborline would rebuild only on already blighted lots. his pen trembling just enough to prove therapy was loosening something calcified. Judge Brooks accepted the settlement. But the way Miles studied the floor told me corporate obedience did not equal personal absolution. A gap I felt in the quiet ride home when Mom texted a single maple leaf emoji instead of congratulations, as if seasonal decor might pad the void she'd helped dig. I filed the signed decree. Yet the silence after the stamp felt like walking off stage before the applause. And the next morning I woke uneasy, sensing stories never truly end where lawyers draw lines, only where life draws breath, ready to push them. The Savannah Tribune feature dropped on Black Friday, From Courtroom to Coastline, how one lawyer blended family drama and environmental law to halt a billion-dollar build. A headline that made my phone buzz until the battery gasped. But under the wash of digital applause, I noticed several emails from small coastal towns Hilton Head, Jekyll, even as far as Cape May, begging me to review suspicious rezoning petitions threatening their marshlands. Every plea carried Uncle James's irony of a teacher's legacy, spreading farther in death than his lectures did in life. And while the temptation to ride the momentum tempted me, I heard Seth hammering cedar shakes in the backyard workshop, reminding me that expansion without foundation is how my father lost his balance in the first place. A warning that hummed like distant surf under the clamor for more. I recorded a new Legal Lighthouse episode instead of answering the emails, dissecting how victory can breed bigger predators and urging listeners to verify local ordinances before chasing courtroom fireworks. But midway through editing, the analytics panel spiked 30,000 streams in 2 hours. Then 50. Then a sponsorship offer from a national outdoor gear brand that dangled 6 figures if I'd pivot to a weekly show. My heart thumped with the old rhythm of scarcity. Yet the ghost of Blue Marlin whispered caution, because quick money usually hides hooks. And by nightfall, I drafted a counteroffer demanding the brand fund a sea turtle tagging program in exchange for ad time, sending it off with a grin that dared them to value biology over branding. Sunday sunrise colored the cottage porch gold when Dad's sedan crunched up the drive. He emerged not with lawyers or blueprints, but with 2 dented travel mugs and a battered tackle box. A memory in motion of Uncle James's fishing rituals. And as we walked the pier, Dad admitted therapy homework required a living amends showing up. Not showing off, so we baited lines in salt-sweet dawn, saying little, until he asked whether forgiveness was a verdict or a sentence. I told him forgiveness is a renewable permit. You keep it by respecting its terms, and he nodded, casting into choppy water where mullet flipped silver. The first silence between us that felt like fertile ground instead of a minefield, hinting at catches yet unseen. 3 days later, the outdoor gear company accepted my counter, pledging $50,000 annually to Loggerhead Savannah Trust. But Miles rang that evening with tension coiled in every syllable. Warning Harborline minority shareholders were furious Dad donated shares without board discussion. And a splinter faction planned to sue unless a new sustainability roadmap boosted earnings. The déjà vu of boardroom greed tasted like brine, yet instead of dread, I felt design. Because if my fight taught me anything, it's that leverage blooms from optics. And a live-streamed beach cleanup featuring investors might shift narrative faster than any memo and idea that sparked like magnesium, promising a showdown wrapped in sand and screenshots. I pitched the plan to Lila Carter, a New Year's Eve Turtles by Torchlight event, where shareholders would plant dune grass under biologist guidance, live-streaming corporate restitution in real time. Her eyes lit with headline greed. But she countered that spectacle without sincerity could backfire. So we structured every frame: kids explaining hatchling orientation, Seth unveiling solar-powered boardwalk lights, Dad measuring silt fences, and me moderating Q&A on balancing profit with preservation. It looked perfect on paper. Yet perfection courts chaos. And 2 weeks before the event, NOAA issued a severe nor'easter watch that threatened to flood half the island. A storm that would test whether Harbor Line's newfound humility was storm-rated or merely staged, setting nerves jangling like rigging before a gale. As clouds stacked steel gray over Christmas Eve, Mom arrived unannounced, makeup understated for once, holding a box of cedar-scented ornaments she'd crafted from salvaged cottage shingles. She confessed her decor channel hemorrhaged followers after the scandal, and sponsors demanded authentic atonement content. But filming her repentance felt exploitative, so she asked to hang ornaments in private. And while we strung them beside Seth's minimalist lights, she broke down describing the terror of waking each day to trending hashtags associating her name with greed, a vulnerability I hadn't seen since childhood toothaches. And when she finished, I told her camera-free deeds are the only ones that heal, inviting her to join beach patrol on storm night. An invitation ending with her nodding through tears that tasted of salt air and regret, foreshadowing waves she'd soon face. The nor'easter struck on December 30th, 7-foot surge battering dune fences and shoving knee-deep foam halfway up cottage steps. Dad, Miles, Mom, and 30 volunteers fought wind that howled like freight as we relayed sandbags, Lila's live-stream gimbal shaking but unflinching. And in one gust, Mom lost her footing camera lights, catching her plunge into swirling water. Dad dove, hauled her up, reporters' flashes frozen on his soaked suit, and that raw spectacle of parental instinct eclipsed months of boardroom arrogance in a single viral frame. By dawn, the surge receded, fences held, and the hashtag #HarborLine helps replaced #HarborLine hurts atop regional feeds. Proof storms can erase footprints or carve new paths depending on whose hands move the sandbags. A revelation still settling when the first 2026 hatchling tracks will appear. New Year's fireworks snapped over Tybee Light Station while I uploaded Legal Lighthouse episode, When Waves Rewire Family. Sponsor credits rolling past footage of shareholders ankle-deep planting Spartina grass, and notifications pinged with nonprofits from Cape May to Key West, wanting blueprints for similar partnerships. I booked nothing, choosing instead to watch Dad and Mom shoulder bump while packing leftover dune steaks, their laughter tentative but real, and somewhere between their chuckle and the hiss of fireworks dying over black surf, I realized the cottage story had rippled far beyond revenge, into a manual for turning litigated hate into negotiated habitat. Yet manuals require updates, and tomorrow's tide will test every chapter. A thought that pricked my lawyer's instinct even as Seth's arm wrapped my shoulders and the lighthouse beam arced overhead, promising guidance. Not guarantees. Into whatever breakers rise in a January thaw, blanketed savanna in soft mist. But behind the gentle weather, a new front brewed. The splinter faction of Harbor Line shareholders filed notice of intent to depose me, Dad, and Miles, framing the loggerhead share donation as misappropriation of corporate assets for private penance, a phrase that coiled in my inbox like a venomous snake and reminded me victories are never permanent, only rented until someone stronger tries the lock. So I drove to the downtown law library and mapped statutes while Seth sketched storm-resilient dune walkways beside me, the two of us sharing ginger tea and an unspoken understanding that neither marriages nor coastlines survive without constant reinforcement. A truth punctuated by every title chart pinging flood alerts for the next full moon cycle. 2 days into discovery, Dad called at dawn, voice flat with exhaustion, confessing he'd offered the dissident board seats on a new blue carbon offset project if they'd drop the suit. But they smelled desperation and countered with a demand for my cottage deed as collateral. An ultimatum so audacious it almost made me laugh. Instead, I reminded him adversaries thrive on panic and that optics remain our sharpest weapon, suggesting we fast-track the turtles by torchlight cleanup to preempt their narrative. live streaming proof of community value before depositions could paint us as sentimental thieves. A plan he accepted with a weary exhale that sounded like decades of command habits being broken one sigh at a time. And as we hung up, I felt the old role reversal click. Daughter coaching father through crisis, even if the scoreboard still read, Hayes family won, corporate vultures circling. Preparation spun into high-gear montage. Theo hardened our livestream servers against bot spam. Lila secured drone permits for night footage. Miles convinced Harborline's finance team to release audited sustainability metrics. And Mom, ever the influencer pivot, filmed a behind-the-scenes series of volunteers repurposing plastic debris into boardwalk planks. Her tone stripped of branding gloss and replaced by something raw that viewers sensed immediately. Subscriber numbers ticked upward for the first time in months. And even Seth's stoic foreman facade cracked into a grin when he saw comment threads praising the comeback of Coastal Craft Mom. Proof redemption arcs sell better than any resort brochure. A data point I tucked away for future negotiation, because sentiment converts to shareholder leverage faster than spreadsheets. A fact our opposition underestimated. Setting the stage for our next strategic wave. Torchlight Eve arrived under cloudless indigo skies. The nor'easter's scars barely visible now that volunteers had bulldozed drift logs into fish habitat berms. And as we wired amber LEDs along the dune fence, CNN's coastal desk tweeted a teaser, Family Feud sparks corporate conservation live in 12 hours, guaranteeing eyeballs and steaks. Backstage in a borrowed school gym, Dad paced like a rookie instead of a titan, clutching note cards he never used well. So I took his hands, felt the tremor, and said the only lines that mattered. Speak to the turtles, not the board, a mantra that steadied him enough to join Miles, Mom, and me on the makeshift stage where 100 schoolchildren in reflective vests waited with buckets of dune grass seedlings, their nervous excitement a mirror of our own. And for a fleeting second, I realized no courtroom ever felt this consequential. Because juries decide past guilt while kids inherit future coastlines. A responsibility that tightened every chest breath as the countdown flashed 10 seconds to live. The broadcast exploded in warmth, lanterns bobbing like fireflies. Brass band riffing on This Little Light of Mine. Dad opening with an unscripted admission that coastal greed nearly eclipsed his humanity. Miles explaining carbon sequestration in dunes. Mom demonstrating how to weave microplastics into erosion nets. Seth unveiling solar path lighting that toggles off automatically during hatchling peaks. And me closing with a pledge that every Harborline quarterly report would publish turtle nest counts alongside profit margins. A statement so radical, the chat feed burst into seashell emojis, and the shareholder faction's lead attorney DM'd cease and desist threats within minutes, proof we'd hit their nerve and probably won the optics war. But as we wrapped and children planted the final seedlings, a siren wailed from the far pier Coast Guard lights, scanning for a capsized shrimp trawler pushed too close by residual storm swell. And without thinking, Dad grabbed life vests. Miles launched skiff lines. Seth sprinted for medical kits. The cameras still rolling. 20 harrowing minutes later, volunteers hauled 3 soaked deckhands to safety, including a bruised teenager who recognized Dad from newspapers and asked if billionaires always smelled like diesel and seaweed, earning a half-laugh, half-sob that cameras caught unfiltered, instantly framing Robert Hayes not as villain or saint, but as human. A nuance no lawsuit could easily weaponize, and that authenticity trend spiked higher than any press release, flipping our perceived narrative a full revolution. At midnight, the faction withdrew its deposition schedule, citing community relations review. By dawn, Harborline stock stabilized, pinned to headlines praising rapid corporate response. And I realized we hadn't just survived, we'd realigned profit incentive with preservation. At least until the next greed surge. But the victory felt legitimate because it hinged on behavior, not paper. a lesson Uncle James would have underscored with a chalkboard quote if he were still here. And as I collapsed on cottage steps, watching amber LEDs wink off one by one to guide unseen hatchlings, my phone buzzed with a single text from Dad Permit, renewed daily. See you at sunrise. I pocketed the device, listening to surf hush over moonlit sand, aware that even when battles quiet, tides persist, and somewhere beyond the breakers, new eggs already rested under cooling dunes. Fragile, determined, waiting for the next moon to call them forward. A reminder every ending is simply a comma before the sea writes its next line. January slid into February on a hush of calm tides. Yet calm never lasts long on Tybee. 3 weeks after Torchlight, the Georgia House introduced Bill 218, a slick proposal to streamline coastal development that would slice loggerhead buffer zones in half. And the lobbying signatures at the bottom belonged to the same investors who had tried to pry my deed loose. A revelation that hit like cold brine because they'd learned from their PR bruising and decided to change the law instead of the optics, leaving me staring at the text on my screen with the déjà vu dread of a lawyer who knows the courtroom just moved to a Capitol hallway, a shift that tingled like storm static against the scars of our recent battle. Miles called first, breathless, saying the faction planned to leverage the bill to bully Harborline back into traditional resorts. Dad's sobriety from greed trembled audibly through the phone as he admitted corporate bylaws would force him to follow shareholder mandate if the law flipped, meaning our détente balanced on a political vote scheduled exactly 1 month away, a ticking window that felt shorter than any litigation deadline because public opinion can sway or sleep, and I could already sense the lobbyists' hush money tide rising across social feeds, a creeping undertow that threatened to drag the cottage story back into obscurity unless I found a new lantern, brighter than lawsuits, to pierce their engineered fog. Lila suggested a cross-state coastal coalition rally, but mass protests fatigue viewers. Theo pitched data visualization ads. Yet graphs rarely ignite hearts. It was Mom who, during a quiet sanding of driftwood frames, murmured that nothing moves Southerners like a good gospel choir, an offhand remark that cracked open possibility. Because music sinks deeper than policy, and if we could fuse melody with message in the very rotunda where the bill would be debated, cameras might follow the echo, turning legislative drudgery into frontline drama, an idea that pulsed so right I felt the cottage floor tilt, urging me forward. 30 days became a blur, Seth drafting portable stage sketches, Miles leaking faction emails to friendly reporters, Dad recording a raw video confession explaining how buffer zones saved Harborline from ruin, a clip that went mildly viral. Meanwhile, I convinced Judge Brooks, retired but still formidable, to helm a bipartisan faith and environment roundtable under the dome's acoustics, and Mom rallied 3 church choirs into 100 voices ready to belt This Little Light with lyrics tweaked to rhyme hatchling with happening. A chorus rehearsed in the gym where we'd once stored sandbags, their harmonies lifting dust motes like prayer, each note polishing our resolve as Bill Day sprinted toward us like a black flag hurricane. I expected opposition to smear us as sentimental. Yet, when we arrived at the Capitol, the lobbyists underestimated the potency of grandmothers in matching teal robes. The first organ chord shocked marble. Reporters' booms angled to capture sound that made tourists stop mid-flash. And as Judge Brooks opened with statistics tying dune health to hurricane mitigation, hard dollars meeting hallelujahs, the atmosphere morphed from sleepy hearing to revival tent. A transformation that rattled Representative Calder long enough for Lila to lob a question about campaign donations. A stumble that became headline footage, looping through evening news, causing 3 fence-sitting legislators to request buffer zone briefings before nightfall. An incremental shift, but enough to smell blood in the rip current. The vote tallied at midnight, 52 against 49 for Bill 2:18 dead on arrival, and the rotunda erupted in choir reprise. But my spine only loosened when Miles texted a single turtle emoji. Confirming Harborline's stock ticked up on investor confidence and stability. Irony sweet as peach cobbler, since that stability now hinged on the very protections lobbyists tried to gut. And while Dad's grateful voicemail cracked under the weight of humbled pride, I caught myself studying the dome's shadow, recognizing that power never sleeps. It merely changes tactics, a realization both sobering and galvanizing because it meant vigilance, not victory, would define our next chapters. Driving back at dawn, the Atlantic shimmered pewter and pink, and when the cottage roof finally peaked above dune grass, I felt the subtle shift of internal compass settling on due north again. But before I could step onto the porch, Theo forwarded an email from Cape May organizers requesting the Rotunda song strategy template. Evidence the fight stretches far beyond one island. And as I opened the door, the aroma of salt patch cedar reminded me walls protect, yet lighthouses guide. So I exhaled, powered up the laptop, and began drafting a toolkit, knowing each keystroke passed the flame further, convinced the next tide of greed would indeed roll in. But now a chorus of voices across the coast stood ready to sing it back, a closing thought that sparked like sunrise on wave crests, promising the story continues right where resilience meets the sea. Story 2. I pulled into the Carter family driveway just as dusk settled over the snow-dusted lawns of our Boston suburb, boots crunching on frost-coated gravel as I carried my armful of carefully chosen gifts to the front door. I paused beneath the wreath icicle lights, blinking like distant stars, took a breath of cold night air, laced with pine and cinnamon, and forced a warm smile for the holiday. Inside, the living room glowed with dozens of twinkling bulbs and the scent of baked ham, while the strains of carols drifted from the kitchen, promising that familiar comfort I'd clung to since childhood. But when Mom intercepted me mid-greeting and jerked her thumb toward the garage, her voice clipped as broken glass. "Your seats are out there." Izzy. I knew the performance was over, and I was the unwelcome afterthought. I stepped into the garage, its lone folding table set beside bins of forgotten decorations and rusty tools, plates and glasses askew beneath a bare bulb's harsh glare. My brother Michael's laugh ricocheted off the concrete walls. Even Buddy gets the table before you, and across the open French doors, I glimpsed the rest of the family gathered around the grand dining table. Name cards perfectly aligned, dog bowls waiting for our golden retriever at the head of the room. Their smiles, so serene inside, felt like electricity against my skin at that moment. I was erased. I didn't protest or crumble. I simply crossed the threshold again, retrieved the single gift tucked under the tree, turned to Michael, and met his smirk with a steady gaze. "You might want to read what's under your plate," I said softly, then walked out before he could ask a question I didn't intend to answer. The cold air hit me like a revelation as I closed the garage door behind me. I didn't linger to hear his shout or the hollow crash of porcelain against tile. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering above empty parking spaces, promising solitude amid a holiday haze. I sat in a vinyl booth alone, a steaming cup of coffee rendered nearly cold by distraction, and pulled from my coat pocket the manila envelope I'd taped beneath Michael's charger plate, 3 pages of slow-burn truths, laid out in dates, bank statements, and transcripts of a drunken confession overheard in this very garage last summer, where he'd boasted about redirecting my grandfather's trust funds without my knowledge. With each line I'd written, my pulse had steadied, as if reclaiming pieces of myself I'd long let slip away. At 2 a.m., I slipped the folded letter inside the envelope's flap sealing it with clear tape and the finality of a gavel's strike. I didn't need a dramatic exit or tearful confrontation. I had my evidence, and they would have their reckoning. I sat back as the coffee cooled, let the diner's fluorescent hum wash over me, and stared at the door, half expecting someone to burst in with frantic apologies. But no one came. Instead, I watched the steam curl above my mug, thinking how easy it was to vanish when you stopped playing your part. Outside, the neon sign buzzed against a sky alive with distant fireworks family. Tradition and unity felt as distant as those stars. I finished my coffee, left the envelope behind like a final gift unclaimed, and walked to my car knowing that Christmas morning would bring the fallout they deserved, and that for the first time in years. I was ready for it by the second morning after I'd severed their Netflix and rent transfers. The Parker family group chat had become a digital purgatory. Unread pleas and frantic emojis piled up as my siblings texted wild guesses. Is the Wi-Fi down? Did someone hack our account? Mom. The groceries never arrived while I sat by my bedroom window, coffee steaming in my palm, watching fog drift over the Cambridge rooftops. The panic unfolding in those blue message bubbles was almost beautiful in its symmetry. They'd spent a lifetime leaning on me to plan, pay, organize, and now they couldn't even microwave leftovers. I closed my eyes and inhaled the crisp winter air, tasting freedom for the first time, yet wondered how long it would take before someone dared ask why I'd vanished. That afternoon, Aunt Linda called on my mobile, her voice trembling between anger and worry as she explained how the kids were eating cold cereal because the pantry order never arrived. How she sat in front of a blank TV screen, baffled. I listened to her guilt-tinged sobs, each one punctuating the claim she'd always been just too busy to help me when I needed it. When she finally whispered, "Emily, are you really okay with this?" I felt a strange swell of pity for her confusion and replied softly, "Yes, Aunt Linda, I'm fine." Then let the line go dead. In that pregnant silence, I realized that even my most loyal supporter had been complicit in ignoring me, and now I'd forced her to see what it felt like on the other side. By early evening, I met Olivia Chen at the taco truck near MIT, its neon sign buzzing in the twilight, over carne asada tacos and a shared order of spicy salsa. I confessed my plan to cut ties completely streaming: rent, grocery boxes, even the emergency fund. She slid me a card for her cousin, a real estate attorney who specialized in family trust disputes, and warned me that I needed a legal anchor before things spiraled beyond my control. I nodded between bites, the lime tang grounding me as I drafted a mental checklist: freeze the account, serve notice, gather statements, document every suspicious charge. Each item was another brick in the wall I was finally raising around my own life, and I shivered at how quickly the ground had shifted beneath us. That night, back in my living room, my phone vibrated with a new message from Jake M. "Why did you ghost us? We're trying to figure out how to split rent for the cabin." His casual tone felt like salt in a fresh wound. I opened my laptop, drafted a terse email to my bank: unauthorized access to shared account. Please provide transaction history from June to December, and hit send. The confirmation pop-up blinked like a second gavel, and I realized that while they were busy dividing the cabin costs, I was reclaiming every dollar they'd stolen from my grandfather's trust. As the email notification dinged on my screen, I felt the weight of months of indignities lifting, but I knew the real showdown was still to come. Under the glow of my bedside lamp, I reviewed the morning's news headlines: local family embroiled in trust fund scandal, Boston siblings feud in holiday season, community stunned as Carter family unity shatters. I sipped herbal tea, its warmth spreading through me, and smiled at the irony that my silence had become such a spectacle. Tomorrow, the hearing would begin. My lawyer would present the evidence I'd painstakingly compiled: bank statements, audio clips of Michael's boastful confession, transaction records revealing every diverted penny. I closed my eyes, imagining the courtroom hush as the truth fell like a hammer. And in that electrified moment before sleep claimed me, I whispered to the darkness, "This is where they pay for making me invisible," knowing full well they'd find no chair left for apologies. I woke before dawn, heart drumming like a warning in the darkness, and tiptoed past the Christmas tree in the living room toward my home office, where banks of evidence awaited printed bank statements showing diverted trust fund transfers, an audio clip of Michael's boast in the garage last July, screenshots of the family group chat laughing at my expense. The silence wrapped around me, but my mind was a riot of whispered doubts and fierce resolve as I methodically organized every file into date-stamped folders, knowing tomorrow I would stand in federal court and demand what was mine. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Anna Chen, the colleague-turned-legal ally who confirmed our digital forensics report was airtight. Her calm voice guided me through the final checklist. Confirm the Shell LLC's dissolution. Notarize the audio transcript. File the motion to freeze the Carter Family Trust account. My coffee grew cold beside me, untouched. As I realized how deeply the betrayal had cut, this wasn't merely about a garage seat at Christmas, but 8 months of invisible sacrifices and stolen inheritance material proof that will dismantle my brother's smug empire. At noon, Aunt Melissa's shaky voicemail lit up my phone. The pantry delivery never came. How could this happen? Her quavering plea held both accusation and fear, a raw testament to how thoroughly I'd disrupted the family's expectations. I pressed play again and let her questions tumble into silence, imagining her pacing the same living room where I once listened to her laughter. The gulf between us felt like an ocean, yet I dared her to cross it, forced her to face the consequences of ignoring me for years. Late afternoon, I navigated Cambridge's icy streets to meet Officer Rachel Diaz at the Carter estate. Now a crime scene of financial fraud, she showed me her report: unauthorized subletting citations, emergency freeze notices, each stamp of officialdom, another nail in the coffin of my family's perfect holiday facade. Standing on that frosty sidewalk, I clicked the seal on the eviction notice and felt a surge of vindication. They had weaponized tradition against me. So I reclaimed tradition itself, wielding it as a mirror to reflect their greed. By early evening, Olivia and I huddled at the taco truck, the neon glow painting her concerned features in electric hues. She folded her arms and said, "You're strong enough to finish this, but don't lose yourself in the fight." Her words struck a chord I hadn't known was missing. Beneath the roar for justice lay a fragile ache for belonging. I nodded, letting her kindness refill my battered confidence. Even as I reaffirmed my plan: present the evidence, demand restitution, and walk away from the wreckage with my integrity intact. That night I lay awake in bed, the judge's gavel echoing in my mind, waves of dread and anticipation crashing in equal measure. I pictured the courtroom's hush, every eye fixed on me as I slid the USB drive onto the counsel table. I felt the weight of that moment in my bones. This was the climax of months spent gathering truth from betrayal's rubble. And as the clock in the hall chimed midnight, I realized I would no longer be the daughter sidelined to the garage. Tomorrow, I would claim my seat at the table of justice, and the next chapter would begin with my truth laid bare. I arrived at the Suffolk County Courthouse just as the winter sun dipped behind red brick facades, the air sharp with frost. Inside, the mahogany-paneled hallway smelled of polish and old leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows let in strips of pale light. I clutched my briefcase, its contents heavier than any holiday gift, with Izzy Carter engraved on the brass plaque. My heart thumped against the cold hush as I passed portraits of stern judges and paused before Courtroom 4B, steeling myself for what was to come. Courtroom 4B brimmed with muted tension polished benches. A long oak table where my parents sat, flanked by my brother Michael and his attorney, Bruce Covington. Their faces masks of practiced calm. The bailiff called the case. Judge Linda Perez took the bench with a cool nod, and Covington rose first. He spun a narrative of misunderstandings and family loyalty, his voice syrupy as he described the contested trust as a forgivable mistake. As his words floated over the silent room, I felt every smirk tighten like a noose, yet I waited for my cue. When Covington finished, I stood, my pulse steadied as I placed a sealed envelope before the clerk, the letter I left under Michael's plate. Now, official evidence. I summarized months of financial discrepancies, diverted trust fund payments, credit card withdrawals to support Michael's second mortgage, even his own admission captured in a garage recording, with each detail. I watched their composure fray. Michael's cheek paled. My parents' eyes flickered, and I pressed play on the audio clip that would shatter their facade. The courtroom air crackled as the judge leaned forward, eyebrows arched in surprise. While the family exchanged frantic glances, Aunt Melissa's gasp echoed from the gallery, and my cousin Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth as she replayed the recording on her phone. Judge Perez tapped her gavel softly, then asked my lawyer to introduce the forensic report confirming the trust's misappropriation. As she reviewed the redacted bank statements and notarized affidavits, I felt the ground shift beneath their privilege and wondered how justice would land. Covington rose again, stammering thin defenses about temporary financial strain. But Judge Perez cut him off. She ordered a freeze on the Carter family trust account and set a restitution hearing for January, citing elder fund protections. Michael sank into his chair, shoulders slumped, while my parents exchanged tremulous whispers. Their world, once anchored in holiday cheer and unspoken rules, had crumbled in under an hour. And as the bailiff called recess, I rose quietly, knowing the real reckoning awaited beyond these walls. Later that evening, I walked Cambridge's icy sidewalks toward my apartment, every breath visible in the streetlight glow. My phone buzzed with news alerts. Local designer exposes Carter Trust scandal. Judge freezes family trust amid holiday feud. Community outraged by brother's betrayal. I paused beneath the elm trees, their branches etched against a starless sky, and let the silence settle around me. Tomorrow I would answer any calls or messages. But tonight I would simply exhale, knowing I had reclaimed my seat at the table of my own life, and the next chapter was mine to write. I woke to the soft glow of sunrise filtering through my curtains, the courthouse verdict still humming in my mind as my phone buzzed with a flurry of unread messages. My parents' names flashed insistently, pleas for forgiveness, frantic inquiries about the frozen trust account, while my brother's voicemail crackled with blame and regret. I let them go unanswered, breathing in the quiet that followed months of turmoil, and realized this silence was the clearest boundary I'd ever drawn. Later, I drove out to the Carter estate, now shuttered and stripped of holiday wreaths, its windows dark like eyes that refused to meet mine. The eviction notice plastered on the front door crackled in the cold wind. Inside, the grand dining room sat empty, chairs upturned, name cards still tucked beneath plates, like ghosts of a cruel Christmas past. I walked each room slowly, my footsteps echoing on the polished floors, and felt a twinge of sorrow for the home I once loved before their betrayal made it feel alien. By mid-afternoon, Aunt Melissa's voice rang on my cell, trembling with apology as she confessed she'd known of Michael's misuse of the trust for months, but feared confronting him. She begged for reconciliation. offered to testify on my behalf, and promised to help repair what was broken, yet I recognized her plea as another attempt to minimize the wreckage. I thanked her for her honesty and let the silence stretch, leaving her to reckon with her own complicity. That evening, I returned to my apartment and opened the newly established Carter Family Foundation account, assets recovered now earmarked for financial literacy scholarships in my grandfather's name. I drafted a mission statement honoring his legacy of generosity, ensuring no other relative could exploit his trust. As I hit submit, I felt purpose bloom where resentment had once festered, transforming the shards of family drama into a platform for genuine justice. On Friday morning, I packed a small duffel and drove north to a secluded lake house in New Hampshire. No schedule, no expectations, only the promise of solitude. I settled into a creaking rocking chair on the porch, the lake mist swirling at my feet, and let memories drift free. Childhood laughter, stolen trust, and the moment I chose self-respect over silent sacrifice. The horizon, painted in pink and gold, whispered that healing would be a journey, not a destination. As dusk fell and the first stars blinked overhead, I penned a letter not to my family, but to myself, affirming I would never again subsume my worth to others' whims. I closed the notebook and gazed at the mirrored lake, its surface a perfect reflection of sky and resolve. In that hushed twilight, I understood the greatest gift I'd reclaimed wasn't money or apology, but the right to belong on my own terms, and with that truth, I stepped forward into whatever came next. Story 3. Evie Carter sent the final mortgage payment to her parents' bank 2 days before their 30th anniversary, wiring the lump sum through her irrevocable trust with no fanfare, just a simple card. Happy anniversary. The house is yours. She imagined their surprise, maybe even a grateful tear or two, and felt a flicker of hope that at last they'd see her as more than the family's dependable backstop. Instead, that evening her phone erupted with a group text, "We're giving your room to Brian's fiancée. Unlike you, she actually contributes to this family." A second message from Margaret Carter added, "Don't make it awkward, just be grateful you were ever included." Evie's thumb hovered over the keyboard before she tapped one word, "Noted." In the hush that followed, she realized this was never about space in the house. It was about power in their lives. That night, she made 3 calls: first to Natalie Brooks, her family law attorney, then to Marcus Lee, her financial advisor, and finally to Karen Shu, the property manager she trusted for her rental portfolio. Over soft-spoken conversations, they confirmed what Evie already suspected when she'd paid off the mortgage through her trust and taken title. Her parents became occupants, not owners, and eviction could follow with the right legal and technical maneuvers. Quietly, Natalie drafted the necessary transfer of ownership documents. Marcus prepared the notice of trust revocation. Citing a material respect clause Brian and Richard had unwittingly signed, Karen agreed to disable the gate key fobs and update the security codes. By the weekend, Evie's silent surprise would explode into an unignorable reality. Saturday dawned gray and drizzling when Evie checked the gated community security feed. Richard Carter swiped his fob at the entrance only to be denied, then pounded the keypad in disbelief. Behind him, Margaret's shoulders shook with frustration, and Brian circled like a storm, ranting into his phone. Across town, Evie sipped tea in her home office, listening to the muted commotion crackle through her WhatsApp feed. She felt a curious calm, no triumph, no shame, just the cool certainty that the house was no longer theirs to command. When Karen followed up with texts confirming that key fobs were disabled, Brian's voicemail filled her inbox with panicked pleas for access. Step 1, Evie thought, checking off the cage she'd built around their entitlement. That afternoon, Karen posted an official notice of change in ownership and management, and on the front door of 123 Evergreen Lane, the white paper, laminated and crisp, declared that the property was now under Trust Edge Holdings and that occupancy rights had been revoked for non-compliance with the Trust's Respect Clause. No eviction, no angry court brawl, just legal finality. By evening, the Carters' attempts to call Evie or text her through their shared family plan bounced back as undeliverable, and their gate codes remained locked. Only Brian's fiancé managed to message Evie via Instagram, pleading for a sit-down like adults. Evie agreed on her terms, at a neutral place, and well outside the walls they'd assumed she'd never breach again. On Monday morning, the Carter family assembled in a downtown co-working conference room. Richard's posture stiff, Margaret clutching her purse, Brian's fiancée shifting in her seat. Evie arrived with a leather folder and a calm, measured stride. First, she laid out the deed title officially held by her trust, not their names. Next came the trust documents, each signature highlighted, including the clause permitting revocation of occupancy upon material disrespect. Richard's lips parted. No words formed. Margaret's eyes welled. Brian's fiancée stared at the floor. Evie explained they had 30 days to vacate before the property would be listed at market value for cash-only buyers. She slid the folder across the table, nodded once, and walked out without looking back. Silence sealed the room, and for the first time, Evie felt truly free. 2 days after the conference room showdown, Evie Carter watched the aftermath unfold from her home office overlooking Lake Union. Her phone was silent, no frantic texts, no pleading voicemails, only the steady hum of PulsePay's real-time transaction feed reminding her that life went on elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Carters were locked out of their own front gate. Every swipe of Richard's key fob yielded a red light. Margaret paced on the wrong side of the keypad, and Brian's fiancée hovered at the intercom, trying the new call box code that would never work. Evie sipped her tea and checked her watch. Knowing she had given them exactly 30 days, now 28 days remained. By midweek, the neighborhood next-door page lit up with speculation. A neighbor posted a grainy photo of movers hauling boxes from 123 Evergreen Lane, captioning it, "Carter Estate in Transition." Comments ranged from sympathetic hope, "They find a new place soon," to gleeful gossip. Was Evie behind this? Evie scrolled past the chatter without a flinch. Her face in the laptop's camera preview looked calm, composed, unburdened by the drama below. She logged into her Trust Edge dashboard to confirm that the eviction notice had been filed with the county clerk and that the property was set for relisting. A quiet ping signaled a new bid on her rental portfolio, a reminder that eviction, when executed cleanly, was just business as usual. That evening, Evie received an email from Margaret Carter at a new address, a tiny shared duplex miles away. The subject line read simply, "I need to explain. Inside." Her mother's handwriting trembled through the pixels' apologies folded into memories of Evie's childhood laughter, admissions of guilt for the group text cruelty, and a plea for one last conversation. Evie stared at the message, thumb hovering over reply. She remembered the steel edge of her own blockade-disabled phones. Sealed fobs, trust deeds laid across the conference table. Compassion warred with resolve until, at last, she typed 3 words and clicked, "Send, I'll listen Saturday." A fragment of vulnerability cracked her armor. On Saturday morning, Evie drove to a neutral cafe in Capitol Hill, the autumn air sharp against her windshield. Inside, Margaret sat nursing a flat white, eyes rimmed red but chin lifted. Evie slid into the booth and folded her hands on the table. Her mother's apologies spilled out in uneven phrases, confessing how they'd mistaken obligation for affection, how Brian's fiancée had become the unwitting pawn in their hurtful game. Evie listened, chest tight, as tears pooled in Margaret's voice. When she paused, Evie folded the napkin quietly and replied, "I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." Margaret nodded, acceptance and relief mingling in her gaze. Outside, the city bustle pressed in, reminding Evie that personal reckoning always unfolded against a larger world. By the following week, word of Evie's decisive actions had spread through family and friends. An aunt in Arizona left a voicemail praising her tough love, and a cousin forwarded a local newspaper blurb about the pending auction of 123 Evergreen Lane. The Carters, now untethered, applied for subsidized housing and sought credit counseling steps Evie had long hoped they'd take. Meanwhile, Evie drafted a charitable grant in her grandmother's name to support families facing housing insecurity, turning her grandmother's tin heart locket into a symbol of hope for others. Each keystroke reaffirmed that power reclaimed could be wielded for good. On a crisp Friday night, Evie hosted a small gathering on her rooftop patio, close friends, her pastor, even Brian humbled but earnest in tow. String lights twinkled over tacos and wine as they toasted to new beginnings. Evie raised her glass, to boundaries honored, to families rebuilt on respect, and to the freedom we find when we choose our own worth. Laughter and clinks of glass rose into the Seattle skyline as the final toast echoed beneath the stars. Evie spotted movement at the gate, someone lingering below. Uncertain, she set her glass down and walked toward the stairs, heart fluttering with curiosity and caution. Evie Carter paused at the foot of the spiral staircase, the hush of the rooftop party receding behind her as she descended toward the locked gate. Below, Brian's silhouette trembled in the glow of the courtyard's single lamp, his shoulders slumped, one hand pressed against the keypad, the other fluttering at his side as if uncertain the code would ever work. She inhaled the damp night air, redolent of cedar planters and autumn rain, and touched the leather folder at her side, a folder packed with deeds, trust documents, and her hard-won resolve. Brian. She called softly, and he spun around, eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath above them. String lights winked beyond the gate. The city throbbed with distant traffic between them. The weight of 6 years of unspoken wounds pressed down. Evie's voice cut through the tension, clear and calm. "Let's finish this tonight." He swallowed, throat bobbing. I never thought you'd actually lock us out," he admitted, voice raw. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow ring that echoed off the stone walls. "We Mom and Dad. They're living in that duplex now, 2 blocks away. I tried everything, phone calls, texts, pleading at the gate. But nothing worked." He glanced up, shame flickering across his features as he recalled the group text that had sparked this reckoning. "We're giving your room to my fiancé. Be grateful you were ever included." Evie watched a shard of his familiar bravado crumble, replaced by regret he could no longer hide. Somewhere in that quiet courtyard, she felt her own defenses shiver, a reminder that empathy, once her greatest vulnerability, could become a bridge rather than a chasm. Instead of retreating, Evie offered her hand, silent compassion grounded by firm boundaries. "Come up," she said, and together they climbed back to the rooftop where the last guests had drifted off. The table, once littered with wineglass rings and taco crumbs, stood bare beneath the string lights, as if waiting for new beginnings. Evie guided Brian to a folding chair and wrapped a soft throw over his shoulders, the fabric warm against his stiff frame. "I didn't want to see you here," she confessed, "but I also didn't want to see you hurting outside my gate." His gaze fell to the blanket's edge, damp with evening mist. She continued, voice steady, I built this life on my own terms. If you want in, you'll have to respect the rules and earn a seat at my table. Brian nodded, tears glinting in the lamplight, and for the first time he seemed to understand that respect and earning were not abstract concepts, but the very mortar of their fractured relationship. Over the next hour, Brian outlined his plan, a part-time contract arranged through Evie's mentor at Trust Edge, a tight budget drawn up with her financial advisor's guidance, and weekly check-ins with her mortgage broker cousin, Riley, to rebuild his credit. I want to prove I can stand alone, he said, voice steadying with resolve. Evie handed him a copy of the Trust Edge Intern Handbook and a prepaid card for the corner market, simple tools for a fresh start. As she watched him tuck the cards into his jacket pocket, pride blossomed where resentment once lingered. She realized that true retribution had never been about revenge, but about empowering him to reclaim his own life. Outside, the string lights flickered as if echoing her quiet triumph, and the first stars emerged over Lake Union, small beacons in a vast sky, promising that even the longest night yields to dawn. Later, alone under those same lights, Evie felt the familiar pulse of possibility. Her phone chimed with a message from Pastor Emma, proud of you both. She smiled, fingers brushing the tin heart locket she'd worn since childhood, a talisman of silent strength. Ahead lay new endeavors: family, work, community, but tonight she had reclaimed her home and extended a hand built on respect rather than obligation. As the city's hum rose toward midnight, Evie inhaled deep, tasting freedom and purpose in the crisp air. She knew each boundary she'd drawn and each bridge she'd rebuilt had led her here to a story she controlled, chapter by deliberate chapter. The next page awaited, and this time she would write it on her own terms, weeks after sending that email. Evie Carter's routine felt both familiar and profoundly changed, mornings filled with team stand-ups at Trust Edge, afternoons spent sketching product roadmaps, and evenings left open for the first time in years. Then came an unexpected invitation from the Bellevue Community Housing Alliance, a request to share her story at their monthly Women in Wealth luncheon. Evie stared at her phone, heart thumping at the thought of reliving every phone call, every disabled key fob, every corner of that gated community she'd once dismantled. But beneath the flutter of nerves, she felt something new, the conviction that her truth could light a path for others. She accepted, promising herself that when the mic went live, she'd speak not just of loss, but of how boundaries could rebuild hope. In the sunlit hall of the community center, rows of folding chairs faced a podium draped in evergreen garlands. Evie stepped up, scanning faces lined with curiosity and quiet struggle, single mothers balancing bills, recent immigrants learning English, retirees watching their equity erode. She began with the anniversary payment, the tearful call from her father, and the group text that labeled her ungrateful. When she described the trust documents and disabled fobs, gasps rippled through the audience. But as Evie spoke of why she'd drawn a line of reclaiming her story and refusing to be the family's ATM, heads nodded, tears glistened, and hands reached for tissues. As applause washed over her, she knew her voice would carry beyond those walls into lives yet to be shaped. Afterward, a young woman approached, eyes red but shining with relief. I've been covering my mom's medical bills for years, she said, voice trembling. I'm exhausted. Evie folded a hand into hers and pressed a check across the table, earmarked for the Alliance's hardship fund. You don't have to do this alone, she whispered. The woman's breath caught, and in that silent embrace, Evie felt the sweet tension of purpose coiling within her, proof that power reclaimed could be wielded for good. As she stepped back into the Pacific Northwest drizzle, Evie realized that helping strangers heal was a natural next act in her own redemption. That weekend, Evie found herself pulling into the narrow driveway of her parents' new duplex. Margaret Carter opened the door, framed by potted herbs and soft afternoon light, and looked smaller, somehow worn, but resolute. Over cups of chamomile tea, her mother apologized for the group text, for overlooking Evie's sacrifices. "I only see you now," Margaret said, voice thick. Evie listened, heart pinching with both relief and sorrow. She saw in her father's posture, slumped in a wingback chair, the same fatigue she'd once carried. When she offered to help with moving boxes or yard work, not out of obligation but choice, Margaret nodded, tears slipping free. As Evie left their courtyard, the ache of unfinished business settled behind her, leaving space for something gentler to grow. Back in her Bellevue apartment, Evie sat on her balcony and dialed Brian's number. He answered on the first ring, voice hesitant. "I spoke at the Alliance," she said. "They want to start a mentorship program. Would you join me?" Silence crackled. Then a small laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." As twilight softened the sky, Evie traced the tin heart locket at her throat, her grandmother's gift, and her own talisman of resilience. She realized that true retribution had never been about revenge, but about empowering others to stand on their own. Above the city's hum, she felt the hush of expectation lift, replaced by the promise of all they might build together. That night, Evie tucked the locket into her nightstand and closed her eyes to the soft whisper of the breeze. Tomorrow held product launches and community planning sessions and a new chapter with Brian at her side. But tonight, in the quiet after every boundary drawn and every bridge rebuilt, she tasted freedom. And as the final glow of sunset faded from the sky, Evie knew the next page awaited, and this time, she would write it confidently, on her own terms. Evie Carter watched the payment confirmation ping on her phone just as dawn broke over Lake Union. The soft glow of her home office screen, illuminating lines of code and pending PR tickets. She'd spent the weekend buried in resi documentation and trust statutes, determined to surprise her parents on their 30th anniversary. But nothing could have prepared her for the weight of that single transaction. With a few keystrokes, the lingering mortgage debt that had loomed over their Bellevue Rambler since her college years vanished, quietly absorbed by the irrevocable trust she'd established in her 20s. As she drafted the wires and signed off on the closing documents, Evie allowed herself a private smile at the thought of Dad's typical stubborn pride melting into gratitude. By midday, the entire Carter family received her unexpected gift in the form of a simple card slipped into their anniversary bouquet. "Happy 30th. Mortgage is paid in full. The house is yours." Evie pictured her mother Margaret's soft gasp, her father Richard's misty-eyed choke, the siblings crowding around the kitchen island to marvel at the final statement. She imagined a family dinner filled with warmth, perhaps even a quiet acknowledgement of her years of silent sacrifice tuition loans. Cover the bills, every unpaid copay and late-night wire transfer. But when her phone buzzed that evening, her heart thudded against her ribs in confusion, not joy. The group text glowed on her screen in harsh white letters. "We're turning Evie's old bedroom into a guest room for Brian's fiancée. Never contributed, but at least she's part of the family." A second message from Mom followed. "Don't make it awkward. Be grateful you were ever included." Evie's thumb hovered over delete before she tapped back a single word. Noted, in that quiet reply, she felt more clarity than anger. This wasn't about a room or even a thank you. It was about control and entitlement. The unspoken contract that said her love and labor were inherently owed to them. No questions asked. That night, Evie's resolve crystallized into action. She set aside her laptop and dialed Natalie Brooks, the family law attorney who'd once warned her about mixing personal finances and parental expectations. "I need that trust document activated," Evie said, voice low but steady. Natalie agreed to finalize the notice of trust revocation at first light. Next, Evie booked a brief call with Marcus Lee, her financial advisor, instructing him to prepare the notice of change in ownership and immediately freeze all gate access key fobs linked to Richard and Margaret's profiles. Finally, she messaged Karen Shu, the property manager for her rental portfolio, asking her to replace the garage code and disable every fob assigned to the Carter household by Saturday morning. 3 experts, 3 lines of defense, all aligned with the quiet determination that had carried Evie through every family emergency to date. By the weekend, the Carter matriarch and patriarch discovered the hard truth, and real-time fobs refused access. Garage gates stayed locked, and their calls to Evie bounced back as unreachable. Under a brittle autumn sun, they huddled at the keypad, frustration crackling in the crisp air, unaware they had become tenants in what they'd always believed was their home. Meanwhile, Evie sipped tea back at her condo, scanning her watch as Karen confirmed each action had taken effect. No triumphant fist pumps, only the cold satisfaction that comes from reclaiming agency. As the final access denied notification arrived on her phone, Evie allowed herself a moment of quiet. Step 1 complete. And the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted.